Well, hey there, how you doing? It's Simeon here. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. Hope you're doing okay today. I wanted to talk about some ideas about how there can be phenomena that remain hidden from our ordinary reality. Paranormal phenomena, as we call them, Bigfoot, cryptid activity. How is it possible that life forms, creatures like this, can seemingly sort of pop into our reality, according to what witnesses tell us they see, and then disappear again? Not like they walk away or run away, they just sort of are gone. Where do these creatures exist, and how is it possible for them to interact with our physical reality here, but also seem to have, for lack of better words, kind of these ghostly type of qualities, invisibility, cloaking, and so forth? I mean, one explanation would be the more physicalist explanation, that maybe, like for Bigfoot example, their hairs are maybe similar to like polar bears, maybe they're hollow, it gives them a certain transparency or something like that in some conditions. But I don't think that's what's going on, because I think based on our witness testimony, like I wrote about in Dark Matter Monsters, that there are a lot of these types of life forms that, let's just face it, they do things that to us seem really out of the ordinary and really strange and, as I just said, kind of ghost-like. So I think if we look into the research of cold fusion, LENR, and some of the more recent research in black holes and dark matter, we can see that there already exists this idea of smaller scale, non-ordinary matter. I'm talking micro black holes, micro fuzzy dark matter, string-like dark matter that can exist in smaller pockets and smaller spaces. Normally when we think of black holes, right, we think of these large, collapsed stars way out in the cosmos with their intense gravitational fields, and that they're not something here on Earth. And that's the same argument I made in Dark Matter Monsters. With dark matter, we think of it something like just way out there, this type of invisible matter that outnumbers regular matter 5 to 1, that it's somehow far away. But I think just one example here, if we look at the work of Dr. Takaaki Matsumoto in his book, papers put together by Bob Grenier and the Martin Fleischmann Memorial Project, Steps to the Discovery of Electronuclear Collapse, Matsumoto makes this very, I think, profound argument throughout his career. His papers, and these are his papers from 89 to 99, the ones that I'm familiar with here, is that the same processes that we see happening out in the cosmos, in the galaxies and far away, these cosmological processes, also exist in a micro form on Earth. And he specifically made that argument as to black holes. Matsumoto, who was a preeminent nuclear physicist in Japan, he passed away unfortunately last year, had a lot of photos of what he said were micro black holes, very small black holes, that he found in his nuclear emulsions, in his cold fusion, LENR, as we call it now, LENR, low energy nuclear reaction experiments. And these traces of these black holes are very interesting, because as you see, they don't always look like they're round. He calls them black holes, but as you can see, they're string-like. In some cases, they look kind of fuzzy, don't have a really defined boundary, and they can take a variety of shapes and exist on a microscopic scale right here in our reality, embedded in materials. And Matsumoto believed that these micro black holes were created from a process that he called electronuclear collapse, from the collapse of atomic structures, the precursor to nucleonic transmutation, micro ball lightning, and what he believed could create excess heat. So this process, when materials become compressed, as we find in cold fusion reactors, the particles get very close together, confined to a small box, a really small space, begin to attract each other in ways that we normally don't see particles interacting like. This compression keeps on increasing. It's very similar to what we now refer to as negative inertial mass, something that even physicist Wilhelm Weber explored with Carl Friedrich Gauss, I believe in the 1840s, almost 200 years ago. This idea that when particles get very close together, this attractive force can take over. And this is an idea that many other physicists have explored. I'm thinking in Dark Matter Monsters, I wrote about Kouropoulos, who argued that this short-range attractive force overcomes this larger-range Coulombic repulsion. Something we were all taught in high school basic physics, that similar particles of similar charges repel. But apparently, at very small scales, they create an intense attraction that Matsumoto called electronuclear collapse, resulting in very tightly bound structures that change their nucleonic composition and create these tiny, small black holes. So this is a very interesting idea, and something, that Matsumoto has pictures of in his book. You can look at these sort of endlessly, these sort of what appear to be fuzzy black holes. So the real question is, and here's, he's a diagram of how he believed that this process happens from this compression into what he called atomic hydrogen clusters and the breakup of matter, and then these kind of collapsed structures that he called tiny black holes, and even tiny white holes that, on the other side, electronuclear regeneration would regenerate matter. So the whole point about this is, do we find other evidence for this process? I mean, is it just Matsumoto seeing this on his own with his own interpretation, or is this something that's supported by, current physics research? And I think I found evidence that the Matsumoto ideas actually have support even in more mainstream modern physics. There's this article, for example, recently from New Scientist that argues that black holes are not just these round objects far out in space, but they can exist in a fuzzy, string-like form in a microscopic environment. In other words, you could have tiny black holes in the form of strings just in your environment. Now, small black holes, this isn't something to be afraid of. It's not like they're going to swallow the earth or something. The smaller ones are more short-lived, but they have the same properties of black holes, creating this type of gravitational collapse, something that Matsumoto and others have argued happens from an electromagnetic interaction that just is highly compressed and extremely strong. So we have this New Scientist article that says that you can get, as I'll show you, can see the article, the beginning of the article right here. It's a type of hidden black hole that could explain the mysteries of dark energy, and that it's consistent with just saying it's consistent with string theory, this idea. And it goes even beyond what Einstein contemplated, because it can create virtual particles and have the properties that we normally even associate with large black holes. Then there's this other interesting article that I came across, which is that called Stranger Than Metals. And this is really fascinating. It says that there is a better paradigm than the Fermi liquid theory of electric conductivity, which is based on the idea of electrons forming pairs and quasi-particles and so forth, and flowing as particles. This article, Stranger Than Metals in Science magazine, argues that if you posit the idea of black holes beneath the surface of metals, it more accurately explains the data you get from electrical flow in metals than the traditional Fermi quasi-particle idea, which we're all familiar with and forms the basis of the BCS superconductivity idea, Bardeen, Cooper, and Schrieffer, of these Cooper pairs, these pairs of electrons forming up and going to, creating zero resistance as pairs and flowing with no resistivity throughout metals. This article says that if you imagine that there are black holes in metals, you actually get predictions that more closely fit the relationship between temperature and resistivity in metals than the quasi-particle idea, which is really a mind-blower here, because, all of us have been exposed to the idea that electricity is formed from, electrons and particles flowing. And this idea says that imagining intense gravitational fields more correctly explains some of the data we actually see about how electricity flows in metals at various temperatures. So we have sort of two different perspectives here that argue that imagining micro black holes, something that Matsumoto is doing here, more accurately explains some of the behavior we see in materials that we're familiar with. Now, there's another whole line of research from S.V. Adamenko and Vysotsky from formerly Proton 21 Labs in Kyiv, Ukraine, before it was bought by the Department of Energy, U.S. Department of Energy, which is, they said that in their thousands and thousands of cold fusion experiments, they encountered a type of material which they could only describe as a micro black hole. Experimentally, they said this material was dark, it didn't emit any radiation, and it would absorb all materials that it came in contact with, and the only thing they could think of calling it was like a black hole. So it's almost as if they experimentally discovered this type of black hole that this article, Stranger Than Metal, theoretically posits to exist, right? So the Proton 21 Labs, Vysotsky, Adamenko research also shows that there's this intense type of electromagnetic compression that just goes beyond, way beyond classical physics ideas of particle attraction into this incredibly compressed system that literally shreds matter, creates other types of elements, and so forth. So the net consequence of that is you could have materials and processes in your ordinary environment that you physically see working behind the scenes to create exotic physics principles. And this is reflected in the work of Ken Shoulders, who argued in his paper about permittivity transitions, which I'll put a link in below this video, that there were multiple types of electronic processes working, some of which he called them exotic vacuum objects because of their exotic properties. These compressed micro ball lightning type objects that he said, consistent with these previous articles we just mentioned, they can form strings, they can form beads, and I'll put the pictures up here. They can form these fractal-like, plant-like, fern-like branching structures of electronic clusters. And they could form rings, they could form clusters. Now, the big sort of impact of this is that Shoulders argued you could get black exotic vacuum objects. These would be types of micro ball lightning that exist in a state that are decoupled from our physical reality. In other words, they're in our physical space-time, they exist around us, but because of this compression and the intense electrical and magnetic charge that they possess, they have a much lower permittivity, the electrical constant of materials, which is normally set at 1. But in these EVs, it's much, much lower, and they decouple from our physical reality, and they could exist in spaces around us and lead to phenomena such as micro ball lightning embedding themselves in metals and existing for really long periods of time, independent of any power source. Just sort of self-regenerating for days and days and weeks, and even in some Russian experiments for months. Other types of electronic processes that are around us but are decoupled from us physically, but they could occasionally emerge, interact, we would see them, and they could disappear again. Shoulders described this as electronic processes happening at electronic speeds. They just would happen at a whole different speed than we're used to. And he even suggests, right here in the abstract, complex organisms are discussed, composed entirely of exotic vacuum structures that are self-formed at electronic rates without using either mechanical or chemical methods, and which have possessed greatly reduced levels of permittivity. And this is all just in one article from Ken Shoulders, that he argues that even ordinary matter can shift into this dark state and again come back into a normal visible state. So I think when you look at this research and some of the implications of it, it does seem to be consistent with the behaviors of Bigfoots and other types of cryptids, where people report them sort of popping in and popping out of their physical environment, creating strange electromagnetic effects, causing visual distortions and so forth, seemingly being, as did people describe some of these Bigfoot, as darker than dark. It sounds to me a lot like Ken Shoulders' description of black evos. I mean, Shoulders says this has gravitic implications, which he calls mass reduction, and various effects of these exotic vacuum objects on gravity, different types of entanglement, creation of different types of vortex structures, which we know have their own types of physics. And he even goes as far as to say that it can create organisms that arrange themselves on their own sorts of principles that we could describe as life forms, but just work on different physical principles than we're used to. And just one quote from him here about it is, he says, one of the things not mentioned is the likelihood of forming totally black organizations with ghostly properties and being able to operate without our being able to see them in the present way. They might be completely undetectable. So I think if you put all of, and he goes on to say how he believed this is the basis of cold fusion, LENR reaction, and a lot of the exotic electronic activity, sudden battery failure, sudden short-circuiting of devices due to these exotic vacuum objects, because they operate in their own world with their own set of rules, and they have a very different set of physical constants than the type of matter that we're used to. Now, when you look at all of this type of research around micro black holes and stringy types of dark matter, to me it sounds very similar to what people describe around Bigfoot and other types of creatures, the type that Stan Gordon has written about in his books, such as Silent Invasion and Creepy Cryptids and so forth, where people see creatures that have like bands of invisibility and they're partly visible, partly invisible. The predator-like effect that people describe around Bigfoot. This particular idea that the Bigfoot that people encounter and other types of cryptids in these various locations that we've all heard about, they could be popping into the physical places there as if they're coming through a portal or something like this. To me, it would be like they're in their own dark matter pocket in a space, in our environment around us, but we can't see them. And I know that sounds really weird and really strange, the idea that there could be invisible entities in the spaces we're in. But that's what we're being told applies to micro black holes and micro stringy dark matter too, right? So why would it be any different for life forms that are based on those types of systems? If this were to be the case, this is what you would expect. It would also explain why you get some of these very strange metallic sounds around some of this cryptid activity. We heard about this from Ron Moorhead at the Sierra Camp, and I know the Resonance Pro production team that produced the Flash of Beauty films is finishing another Flash of Beauty film about the Sierra Sounds. And the Sierra Sounds, some of the strange sounds around that Ron Moorhead described, not just the chattering of these creatures and the howling and the whooping, and all of those sounds that we're familiar with, were the strange metallic sounds of car doors slamming where there couldn't possibly be any cars way high up in the mountains and so forth. And other people have described these sounds. Martin Groves, in his description of the creatures he encountered at land between the lakes, the combination dogmen, Bigfoot groups that he believed he encountered with his camping partner, who was also another sheriff's deputy. It started with very odd metallic sounds, as he described a door being dragged across a cement surface. Also in Dave Paulides' 411 The Hunted, there's that case of Thomas Messig just disappears from a hunting group with just no trace whatsoever ever found again. in that area, no tracks, nothing. And one of his hunting companions described a metallic sound right before this disappearance happened that he described as a trap shutting. And if you look in the literature, I've talked to Bigfoot witnesses who've described hearing these metallic type sounds too. So I'm wondering whether this is a feature of this type of matter manifesting itself into our physical reality. So this would also help us explain how Bigfoot are seen moving in and out of trees. This is something that is not that rare if you read the Bigfoot encounter literature, you talk to witnesses or people who've talked to witnesses, is that the Bigfoot creatures are seen moving in and out of trees. Ron Moorhead described that with one of his colleagues up at the hunting structure in the Sierras, of hearing these Bigfoot howling sounds coming from a tree in the distance. They walk in that direction, but there's no Bigfoot there. There's just a tree. And then there's something blocking them from getting closer to 10 feet to the tree, something like that distance. So trees have this fractal-like branching structure, and as we just saw in the images that Ken Shoulders had produced, you get these fractal-like bead structures in exotic vacuum objects, and it looks, in some ways, there's some relation to the types of stringy black hole structures we saw in Takaaki Matsumoto. And those structures all have this sort of fractal branching characteristics to them similar to trees. So it could be that we have these dark matter pockets around us, and it's more concentrated in fractal structures that you find around forests, around parks, around trees, plants, and those sorts of structures. And this would explain why Bigfoot are more likely to be seen in these sort of naturalistic areas more so than in cities, because those dark matter pockets, if they are a life form that emerges from such a type of physical structure, kind of a non-ordinary type of matter, at least non-ordinary compared to what we're normally used to, that this exists, this tends to clump and exist alongside other fractal types of structures like trees. It would imply that plants and trees have a dark matter component to them also, and in some ways the Bigfoot creatures and other cryptids they can couple with that dark matter fractal structure that trees are shaped in more easily than ordinary Euclidean objects like we're used to with the typical houses and buildings and structures that we build in our modern society. So that's my thinking about why these micro dark matter and black hole structures might really be significant in our understanding of these life forms, how they operate, how they interact, and why they seem to seemingly come out of nowhere sometimes and go back into nowhere, just vanish. I've talked to several people myself at conferences and so forth that have actually seen something like this. In some cases, they turn into like sparkly types of lights, the creatures, and then they vanish. Or in some cases, you can see this sort of predator-like outline around the creatures. I think it's consistent with the various types of literature we just talked about. And so while it's definitely out there, it's not out of the realm of scientific understanding if we look at some of this more recent research and the experimental research of Proton 21 Labs, Ken Shoulders. There's also another Russian researcher, Rodionov, who in his research described dark matter as being threads. It's another kind of confirmation that dark matter doesn't just have to be clumps of matter, gravitational clumps of matter, but it can form these long threads, which again is it's consistent with Matsumoto's work and Ken Shoulders and others. So I think we have this ensemble of literature and research that's self-consistent, and to me it seems to be consistent with the observation of people who have encountered some of these types of life forms, which we call, cryptids or paranormal or supernatural and so forth, even ghostly, as Ken Shoulders, he said it has ghostly properties, these sort of ghost-like entities, apparitions. But it seems to me that this is consistent with this type of research tradition, and I'm sure we're going to have more of it in the future that confirms to us, as I argued in A Flash of Beauty, Paranormal, Bigfoot, and in Dark Matter Monsters, that there are life forms, just as Ken Shoulders said, that are based on other types of physics, other types of matter, coherent matter, dark matter, that exist alongside us. And even though they may be hard to detect sometimes, just like dark matter is, or black exotic vacuum objects, they can exist alongside us, they can coincide with us, and we won't always be able to easily see them. So that's my thinking on it. I'm always curious what you have to say, so please put your comments in the box below. Thanks for watching. We'll talk to you soon. Take care for now, and bye.